Welcome, everyone. My name is Henry Louis Gates Jr., and I am proud to be the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our W.E.B. Du Bois virtual lecture series. And to proceed with the events today, it's my pleasure to introduce Abby Wolf, Dr. Abby Wolf, who is the executive director of the Hutchins Center.
Yep. Hi, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to this virtual space for Ibram X. Kendi's lecture in our W.E.B. Du Bois virtual lecture series. One housekeeping item I'll share with you. Please write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen by clicking on the bottom of the screen. We ask that you keep them brief as we anticipate there will be a lot of questions this afternoon. Questions may be edited for clarity and length during the Q&A, and we may combine a couple that go along the same lines. If you do not wish your name to be read, please note that in your when you write your question down. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure also to say a few words about Keisha N. Blain, who will introduce Professor Kendi's lecture this afternoon. Keisha N. Blain is an award-winning historian of the 20th century United States with broad interests and specializations in African American history, the modern African diaspora, and women's and gender studies. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh and the president of the African American Intellectual History Society. She is currently a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University, and we were thrilled to have her as a fellow with us at the Hutchins Center last year. Blain is the author of the multi-prize winning book Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom, and the co-editor of 4 books, including the forthcoming book co-edited with today's lecturer, 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition. Her next book, very timely, is called Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America, and it will be published by Beacon Press in 2021. She and Professor Kendi have also collaborated over the years a number of times, co-authoring a few articles together and serving together as editors of Black Perspectives, the award-winning and influential blog of the African American Intellectual History Society. In January, they will deliver the keynote together at the American Library Association virtual conference. And just on a personal note, Professor Blain was a fantastic fellow and a really exciting intellectual. And we're really delighted to have her here today to introduce another dynamic and exciting intellectual. So please join me in welcoming Keisha N. Blain this afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Abby. It's truly an honor to be able to introduce Ibram X. Kendi. He's a wonderful friend and collaborator. And I actually think that he doesn't need an introduction because he is quite remarkable and his work is so influential. And I suspect that if you're here today, it's because you've already read one of his books. And if you haven't read his work, you've been missing out. So try to catch up. But what I will do is provide a broad overview of some of the amazing things that he has been doing. And even this brief introduction will not do him justice because he is truly just, I think, one of the most influential Black intellectuals of our generation. And so it's an honor to have this chance to introduce him. Dr. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University. He is also the director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and he's also a news correspondent for CBS. He's the author of several award-winning books. I'll just mention a few: The Black Campus Movement, Black Students and the Racial Reconstitution of Higher Education, which came out in 2012. And he's also the author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which came out in 2016. And that book won the 2016 National Book Award for Nonfiction. He's also the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, which came out last year. and has been on the New York Times bestselling list, and specifically #1 on that list. He's currently a fellow at Harvard. He's at the Radcliffe Institute, and he's writing a new book tentatively entitled Bones of Inequity, a narrative history of racist policies in America. Like I said, this introduction is brief, but what I've tried to do is just highlight a few of the remarkable things that Ibram Kendi has done. I think in a nutshell, what I will say is that he is truly blazing trails, and he has really been a model for, I think, all of us who are committed to anti-racist work. His research, his writings, his public engagement, everything that he's been doing over the past few years has really been remarkable. And I look forward to his talk today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Blain, for that warm and wonderful introduction. I can say, of course, that you and your work is blazing trails as well. And I don't think I would be able to be conducting the type of research that I'm pursuing and writing what I'm writing if I wasn't writing in an incredible community of scholars and thinkers and intellectuals who are my elders or who are sort of my peers. And so, you know, I'm truly honored to be writing alongside you and other intellectuals, you know, during this time. Of course, I'd like to thank Professor Gates for this invitation to address this distinguished lecture series. I, you know, again, am honored to share a few words, and indeed, I want to share a few words and then hopefully open it up for some dialogue. So one of the most fundamental research questions of our time, of this very moment, is why are Black people dying at 2.3 times the rate of white people from COVID-19? You know, according to the COVID Racial Data Tracker, a collaboration between the Atlantic's COVID Tracking Project and our BU Center for Anti-Racist Research, we've lost at least 41,583 Black lives to COVID-19 to date. Why? According to the APM Research Lab, as of mid-September, 1 in 1,000 Black Americans have died from COVID. There's projections that without swift action, 1 in 500 Black folks could die by the end of the year from COVID-19. Why? You know, why is it that there are 67 Native and Latinx deaths per 100,000 people from COVID-19 compared to 45 white deaths per 100,000 people right now? You know, why is there a racial pandemic within this larger viral pandemic? And so the title of my talk today is on anti-racist research, its approach, its history, and its impact. And really this question of why there's a racial pandemic within this larger pandemic is part of a larger question, because in many ways, Black folks have always been experiencing a pandemic in this country, as have Native people, as have other groups of color. And ironically, despite the consistent pandemic, even before we knew of the word COVID-19, Black people were dying at higher rates from most racial health disparities. But still, in mid-March, many Americans imagined that COVID was going to be somehow the great equalizer. I know that was 6 months ago, and it feels like 6 years ago, especially everything we've experienced. But think about that for a second. In a nation so systemically and pervasively racist, you had so many Americans imagining that COVID-19 was the great equalizer. And how could they do that? because there was no racial data in March. The states were not releasing racial demographic data of who was being infected and even who was dying of COVID-19. But then they started releasing that data by early April. Then by mid-April, it became national news that there were these racial disparities. And then the question became why? The same question we're asking 6 months later. And Americans, almost instinctively, many Americans started answering this new question in the old familiar ways. They started, blaming principally poverty. They refused to recognize, of course, the way racism distinguishes Black poverty from white poverty and even makes Black poverty more vulnerable to a lethal contagion. Or Americans started blaming Black people. To explain the disparities in mortality rates, you had politicians and commentators of all races stating that Black people have more underlying medical conditions. And crucially, they didn't even explain why. It reminds me of the senator from Louisiana, Senator Bill Cassidy, who said on NPR's Morning Edition, now, if you have diabetes, obesity, hypertension, then African Americans are going to have more of those receptors, he said, the coronavirus likes to hit. Now, as a physician, I'm quoting the senator, I would say we need to address the obesity epidemic, which disproportionately, he said, affects African Americans. That would lower the prevalence of diabetes, of hypertension. And then when the senator was pressed on whether these underlying health conditions are rooted in years of systemic racism, Senator Cassidy responded, that's rhetoric. And it may be, but as a physician, he claimed he was looking at science. Now, without question, African Americans suffer disproportionately from chronic diseases like hypertension and cardiovascular disease, diabetes, lung disease, obesity, and asthma, which of course makes it harder to survive COVID-19. But if Cassidy was looking at science, at research, then he'd also be asking, why are African Americans suffering more from these chronic diseases? Why are African Americans more likely to be obese than white Americans and even Latinx Americans? So then, of course, others tried to answer that question. A senior editor at the American Conservative argued that in the South, country white people and country Black people eat the same kind of food, and wondered to what extent Black folks all over the country still eat the traditional soul food diet with lots of grease and salt, pork, sugar, and carbs. And that then caused one of his readers to respond, I'm especially amused by the implication that a racist conspiracy is keeping Brussels sprouts and kale from Black neighborhoods. If people wanted fresh vegetables and salads and tofu, stores would provide them. So essentially, they were saying if there are food deserts, it seems, then Black people are to blame. If Black people receive inferior care from hospitals and doctors, then apparently, according to these thinkers and researchers and writers, Black people are to blame. If Black people are less likely to be insured, then according to them, Black people are to blame. If hospitals in majority Black counties are overloaded with coronavirus patients, then apparently Black people are to blame. According to this logic, racism isn't murderous. Black people are killing themselves, like apparently Breonna Taylor killed herself. According to this logic, to be Black in America is somehow to be suicidal. According to this logic, Black people are to blame for showing up in so many morgues across this murderous land. But then others have embraced a different theory of Black culpability. The New York Times at one point reported an information vacuum, I'm quoting indirectly, in some Black communities allowed false rumors to fester that Black people were immune to the disease. This is back in April. While far-fetched, the early rumors of Black immunity to COVID-19 virus gave some African Americans a fantastical hope, another newspaper in Los Angeles reported. And a Philadelphia city council member said, now we're playing catch up with the messaging and spreading the word that it can affect any one of us. And an activist in LA also told the LA Times that myth that Black folk were immune spread like wildfire on social media, but there was never a concentrated effort from leaders to dispel that myth. What actually spread like wildfire then, and it still is, was another myth, the fable that there was something wrong with Black people, or even at that time, the fable of Black immunity somehow affected Black behavior. Where was the evidence that this was widely believed among Black people? Where was the evidence that it caused Black people to not take the coronavirus as seriously as other groups? And it sort of reminds me of, it's almost like we're back in 1896, in which there are these racial disparities, racial health disparities, and Black people are to blame. And I'm not talking about Plessy v. Ferguson, I'm talking about another racial text published by the nation's premier social science organization at the time, the American Economic Association, a text that was classified by historian Evelyn Hammonds as one of the most influential documents in social science at the turn of the 20th century. Well, Frederick Kaufman, who wrote Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, stated, nothing is more clearly shown from this investigation that the Southern Black man at the time of emancipation was healthy in body and cheerful in mind. What are the conditions 30 years later? Hoffman concluded from the so-called plain language of facts that Black Americans were better off enslaved. They are now on the downward grade, he wrote, headed toward gradual extinction. Hoffman knew his work was a most severe condemnation of even moderate attempts of so-called superior races to lift inferior races to their elevated positions. He rejected that sort of assimilationist racism in favor of his own segregationist racism. The data, he wrote, speak for themselves. White Americans had been naturally selected for health and life and evolution, and Black Americans had been naturally selected for disease, death, and extinction. Gradual extinction, the book concluded, is only a matter of time. With its pages and pages of statistical charts, Race Traits helped catapult Hoffman into national and even international prominence as the Dean of American Statisticians. And even if public health officials and researchers were being honest about their own history, they would be still recognizing him as the father of public health in the United States. And even his biographer stated, in his day, Hoffman achieved greatness. His career illustrates the so-called fulfillment of the American dream, when in reality, his career illustrated the fulfillment of the American nightmare for many Black folks, a nightmare still being experienced 124 years later, from Minneapolis to Louisville, from Central Park to untold numbers of Black coronavirus patients parked in hospitals, on unemployment lives, and even in graves. And once we started knowing, again, in mid-April, that Black people disproportionately were those who were being killed by coronavirus, that's when the states started opening up. And that's also by late April when you had white people demonstrating to reopen states, as they still are. And ironically, at that time, they were still saying somehow that it was Black people who were not taking the coronavirus seriously. And all the while, we knew, according to the evidence, that was actually not true. Actually, a national survey conducted by the Pew Research Center between March 10th and 16th, long before racial disparities and infection rates were documented, this study found that Black respondents at 46% were more than twice as likely as white respondents at 21% to view the coronavirus as a major threat to their health. Ironically, the very people calling Black people ignorant for not taking the coronavirus seriously were actually ignorant of Black people. And so where it went and where it's went since then is, you know, in April, as I stated, many Americans chose this racist explanation saying Black people were not taking the coronavirus as seriously as white people, until eventually challenged by survey data and majority white demonstrations that were demanding to reopen states. Then they started arguing, as they have since then, that Black Americans were disproportionately dying of COVID because we have more pre-existing conditions due to our supposedly more unhealthy behaviors. But even that had been disproven. That was disproven by early summer. According to a study from the Foundation for AIDS Research, structural factors such as employment, access to health insurance and medical care, and the air and water quality in neighborhoods are drivers of Black infection and death, and not intrinsic characteristics of Black communities or some sort of individual level factors. And so all along, we've been trying to answer this question: why are Black people dying at higher rates from COVID-19? And you've had some arguing that it's because there's something wrong with Black people. You've had others arguing it's because there's something wrong with America. And ironically, this is an old question. Why do racial disparities exist? This is a question as old as even American research. It is as old as American researchers, guided by subjective ideas, self-identifying as objective. Indeed, when American researchers historically and commonly share subjective ideas, the subject seems objective, just as widespread illogical ignorance seems to be logical knowledge for many people, just as an echo chamber of alternative facts sounds so real, sounds so factual, when indeed there's no such thing as an objective researcher. Why? Because all racial research has an ideological foundation, whether researchers want to admit it or not. All racial research is built on basic assumptions. These are assumptions we hold before we even ask the research question. How the researcher seeks to answer why a racial disparity exists reveals that researcher's basic assumptions. And there are three basic racial assumptions that undergird racial research. The first, there's something wrong with a particular racial group. The second, there could be something wrong with a particular racial group. And then the third, there's nothing wrong with any particular racial group. See, this first assumption that there's something wrong with a particular racial group is a racist assumption. An assumption is nothing but an idea. A racist idea is any concept that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And in our time, people don't typically say this is what's superior about this racial group, or this is what's inferior about that racial group. They say this is what's right about white people, or this is what's wrong about Native people. The third assumption, that there's nothing wrong with any particular racial group, is an anti-racist assumption. And an anti-racist idea is any concept that suggests that the racial groups are equals, even when there are cultural or even phenotypic differences. And in our time, people are often transforming, I should say researchers are often transforming data and evidence and history into anti-racist ideas that are challenging common beliefs among researchers and even the general public that there's something wrong with Black and brown people. The second assumption, that there could be something wrong with a particular racial group, is invariably held up as the objective and logical and reasonable assumption. And study after study and all sorts of time and money has been going into trying to figure out if there's something biologically or culturally or behaviorally wrong with a particular racial group. And these researchers refuse to assume that there's nothing wrong with any of the racial groups. They think such an assumption is subjective. They They think their own refusal to assume racial equality is objective. They also think that since they refuse to assume racial inequality, that they are objective. They think those that are assuming racial inequality are racist. They imagine themselves as not racist. They self-identify, indeed, in a manner that can't even be identified. What does it even mean to be not racist? What does it mean to be a not racist researcher? They imagine themselves as neutral. Even as they often despise Trump, they've created an alternative world for themselves with their alternative facts that they all believe. And they rage at any anti-racist researcher who bursts the bubble on their world and ask them to put on the mask of history. Because we know history. We know what happens when people do not wear the mask of history. They're more likely to get infected with the second assumption that there could be something wrong with a particular racial group. When the racial disparity arises, they pursue their research, trying to figure out if there's something wrong with the Latinx people. They sit in their own self-described objectivity, exposing others to their ignorant subjectivity. They can't seem to put on the mask of history and realize that they are asking a research question that has already been found. They are like those researchers trying to figure out if the earth is round in the year 2020. They are like those researchers trying to figure out if the climate is changing. They are like those researchers trying to figure out if COVID-19 is worse than the flu, if the dinosaurs are extinct, if humans bleed. Researchers have been trying to figure out if there's something wrong with Black people, as an example, for more than 500 years. They have researched whether Black people are biologically inferior or culturally inferior and behaviorally inferior for nearly 6 centuries. And geneticists have proven that there's no such scientific or genetic thing as the Black race. Indeed, geneticists have found more genetic diversity within Africa than between African people and non-African people. Geneticists have found that populations in Western Africa are more genetically similar to populations in Western Europe than they are to populations in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. But then other researchers have standardized the cultures of white people and assessed the cultural ways of Black people from those white standards. And whenever a researcher creates a cultural standard, that researcher determines the superior and inferior cultures. There's never been anything culturally wrong with Black people. And there's always been something wrong with subjectively standardizing cultures among researchers who call themselves not racist, among researchers who claim they are objective. And then comes behavior. Researchers conflate culture and behavior. And just as there's no such thing as Black biology, there's no such thing as Black behavior. Behavior is something humans do, not races. There are behavioral groups that racialized individuals fall into. There are people of all races who exhibit higher levels of recklessness or of empathy, of laziness, of compassion, of aggression, of peacefulness. But no racial group has a monopoly on any of these human behavioral traits. Black people don't exist biologically and behaviorally. So how could there be something biologically or behaviorally wrong with Black people? But Black people do exist historically and culturally. But any researcher that asks whether Black people are culturally deficient is a researcher that must create a cultural standard to answer that question. And once that cultural standard is created, cultural hierarchy is created. And once that cultural hierarchy is created, culturally racist ideas are created. To ask if there's something wrong with Native people when racist ideas have been soundly disproven only opens the door to racist ideas. Researchers trying to figure out if there's something wrong, when is the researcher going to assume that there's nothing wrong or right about any racial group? Will the researchers spend another 500 years ascertaining what's wrong with Black people, with brown people, with Asian people, when the first 500 years have only turned up racist ideas? When is the researcher going to end the search and realize that they are not going to find the end of the earth? Because the earth is round and racial equality exists. There is racist research and there's anti-racist research. And racist research assumes that there's something, that there is or could be something wrong with a particular racial group. As such, the question of why a racial disparity exists invariably leads to a racist question. What's wrong with Black people? What's wrong with Native people? What's wrong with Black women? What's wrong with Black poor people? A racist research question invariably leads to racist research findings. And these research findings invariably lead to racist narratives, like Black people are being killed more by police because they're more violent and dangerous. And these racist narratives invariably substantiate racist policies, like all the state measures actually mass incarcerating and murdering Black bodies. In short, the racist researcher has fed the public narratives that racist policymakers have utilized to defend the policies that they erected out of rugged economic, political, and cultural self-interest. In short, the racist researcher who self-identifies as not racist, as objective, has fed racism at the same time they were studying whether racism is the problem. Anti-racist research, by contrast, assumes that there's nothing wrong with any of the racial groups. As such, the question of why a racial disparity exists invariably leads to anti-racist questions. What's wrong with power? What's wrong with policies? What's wrong with conditions? What's wrong with practices and processes? And these research findings invariably lead to anti-racist narratives that the problem is power and policy and not what's wrong with people. And these anti-racist narratives invariably substantiate anti-racist policies that can lead to equity and justice for all people. In short, the anti-racist researcher feeds narratives that anti-racist policymakers can utilize to institute or defend the policies erected out of what's best for humanity. And we are living in a time when we need anti-racist research. Racial disparities are all around us and literally killing us like COVID-19. And we need anti-racist researchers, not just to be asking what's wrong with power and policy, not just to be asking how we can reduce racial inequities and injustices. We need anti-racist researchers to be asking, how can we eliminate racial inequity and injustice? You know, there was a time in this country's history when abolitionists were not advocating for the gradual emancipation of Black people. These abolitionists from David Walker to Frederick Douglass to Mariah Stewart to William Lloyd Garrison were demanding immediate emancipation. And though that's what we need to be demanding today, immediate emancipation from the terror and tyranny of racism. We need anti-racist researchers to be asking, how can we eliminate racial inequity and injustice? How can we eliminate police violence? How can we eliminate the genocide against trans women of color? How can we eliminate voter suppression? How can we eliminate racial capitalism? How can we eliminate imperialism? How can we eliminate poverty and food insecurity and housing insecurity? How can we eliminate the crime of school funding gaps? How can we eliminate white supremacy? And how can we empower the disempowered? How can we give to the dispossessed? How can we equalize the denigrated? How can we be anti-racist researchers? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was riveting. Keisha, would you like to ask the first question? If
Yes.
you could come back on. Can you, yes, there you are. And thank you for that fabulous introduction.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and type the question into the chat so everyone can see it. Essentially, my question is about the upcoming elections. We are only 2 weeks away from one of the most significant presidential elections in our nation's recent history. Let's imagine for a moment that Trump is defeated. I know I'm not the only one hoping that is the outcome. If you had the opportunity to lay out a blueprint for the next few steps, what advice would you offer to the new administration? And specifically, can you talk about the kinds of anti-racist public policies that need to be immediately enacted at the national level?
Thank you.
Wow. So I would, say a reparations study that could lead to reparations for Black people. I would say the elimination of money from politics and the ability for everyone to vote in every way that they bank, for registration to be automatic, truly to be a right, not a privilege that can be taken away, for the police and prisons to be defunded, for us to eliminate the school funding gap, to create a scenario in which the kids who have the least amount in their home have the most amount in their schools, to provide basic income for every single American, to provide Medicare for every single American. All right, I'll stop there.
How do we end this cycle of racist research? And let me say, I enjoyed your, I've never heard you speak before. I've just read you, and I got one of your books right here by my right-hand side. But I loved listening to you. It was very thought-provoking and very thoughtful. And we are just across the river from each other, right? I'm in Harvard Square and you're at BU. I presume you moved and you're in place. And we're surrounded by scholars and researchers, people with good hearts, good intentions, who get millions and millions and millions of dollars in research in the natural and physical sciences, in the social sciences, even in the humanities. How do we, who are caught in the grip of what you've defined as this cycle of racist research, how do we get them out of it? How do we take ourselves out of it? If you were in control of the National Science Foundation or the National Humanities or the National Council of the Arts, et cetera, Ford and Mellon, what would your policy be? I'm a practical kind of person.
Yeah.
How would we break this cycle?
So, I mean, one of the things that I was trying to emphasize, Professor Gates, is many researchers just imagine themselves as not racist researchers, and even many reviewers on these grant committees haven't clearly sort of distinguished between racist and anti-racist research. And so if I was, all powerful, I would clearly distinguish in many of these RFPs, as well as, in graduate schools that are training researchers across the hard and social sciences and humanities, the distinction between racist, and anti-racist research. And that really cuts across fields. And I think that's absolutely sort of critical for us to do.
Mm-hmm. Cornel, Professor West, and by the way, Ibram, you call me Skip, okay? You make me feel old, brother. You call me Professor Gates.
Okay.
So is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Good, and I hope this is the first of many, many interactions we have once, virtually, as long as we are forced to live our lives on Zoom. and then in person. And I want to warmly welcome you to our community in person, at our home, at our center, and at our department as soon as I possibly can. Now, we're blessed to have my dear friend and colleague, Professor Cornel West, who's right there on the right of my screen. Corn, can you come off? There you go. Would you like
to see
me
all right?
There you go.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's just a blessing to be in the presence of our dear brother Kendi. And salute you though, brother. An unprecedented success, visibility in terms of your voice, really in the history of Black folk. We've never had a Black intellectual who's been so influential and so visible and so successful and also a force for good. So I salute your strength, your fortitude, your determination. And you know, I just love your hatred of white supremacy and a willingness to speak from your heart, mind, and soul in a very, very, very powerful way. Mike, and I should also add, it's a blessing to be on the list of the 10 most hated professors by the right wing in America. And I'm praying for the safety of your family, and I hope we praying for each other, because it's a blessing to be on that same list, though, brother. But my crucial question in terms of the power of your presentation is, when you talk about abolishing racial capitalism versus abolishing white supremacy, what is the relation of those two abolition projects? And how do you disabuse people of the notion that when you talk about anti-racism, that you're not downplaying predatory capitalism, you're not downplaying economic operations, but you want to be anti-reductionist. You want to recognize that we're not reducing white supremacy just to capitalism or vice versa. But how do you negotiate that space though, brother? Because I know people have been coming at you, and I want to give you a chance to really kind of lay that out.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we look at the relationship between capitalism and even racism, historically or empirically, their intersection is undeniable. And so the origins of capitalism, according to most historians and even economic historians on the left and right, they point to the long 16th century, this period from the mid 1400s to the mid 1600s as really the cradling period of capitalism in Western Europe. Well, it just so happens that that's the very same cradling period of racism, right? They emerged at the same time in the same place. And that's why even in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I describe them as the conjoined twins. And when you look at really the development of capitalism and racism, you can't really separate, you know, the transatlantic slave trade from the development of capitalism. You can't separate the transatlantic slave trade from the development of racism. You can't separate the development of settler colonialism from both racism and capitalism, just as you can't really separate chattel slavery from the development of either. You can't separate the ways in which the capital from slavery was reinvested into the Industrial Revolution from racism and capitalism. And so now you have a world in which the nations that are Black and in Africa are typically the poorest nations. And even in the United States, you have this massive sort of wealth gap. Even in Latin America, if you're darker, you tend to be poorer. And so you can't even separate wealth and poverty or race from wealth, from capital. And so for me, that's why, you know, even the term racial capitalism, to me, it's not a sexy term. It's an accurate historical and empirical term, right? We shouldn't be really separating racism from capitalism, which is why I argue that to be anti-racist is to be anti-capitalist. You know, just like if you're truly anti-capitalist, you have to be anti-racist. But oftentimes in both areas, you have people who claim that they're anti-racist, but they're really not fighting for Black poor people, right? Just like you have folks who claim they're against capitalism, but they're not fighting for Black poor people, right? So, and so I just wanted people to really realize that in order to be anti-racist, we truly have to be against racial capitalism.
Thank you so much,
Cornel, you want to follow up before we open it up?
No. That's what you call an answer.
That was a good answer. A very thoughtful answer. Abby, you're going to curate the questions?
I am, and this is no easy task because they're fabulous questions. So I'm going to do my best. And I'm going to start with, as I said at the beginning, I think, or maybe I just told Professor Kendi this, I try to group the questions as much as possible, so as many of you can get an answer as possible. A number of questions came in about how to teach anti-racism, both to children, K through 12, to elderly parents who may, be a little resistant to this. These questions were Kate DiPietro, Cindy, Jean, Maurice Roberson. So the question, I'll just sum this question up. This is Cindy Jean. As an educator in K-12 schools, I'm wondering how we move teachers to make the work of racial equity a priority while enduring the stress of COVID-19, particularly when many K-12 educators don't see themselves as equity practitioners. And Kate DiPietro says, how can we help students and our own children read and consume both media and research in a way that recognizes, excuse me, when a perspective is racist and when it is anti-racist? And there were several questions along those lines.
So, I mean, I'm a book person. And I mean, obviously I think they asked also about the older folks.
Yes.
I mean, there's just an incredible number of books currently and historically that really document the history of racism in this country, or even allow us to philosophize and really understand how racism operates. And so, I mean, I was just talking to Skip's last book is an incredible book that really documents, of course, racism in the post-Reconstruction era. Of course, Brother West just came out with a 25-year anniversary edition of his Race Matters. There's just an incredible number of books, and working and reading a book with an older person, there's really nothing sort of better than doing that. And the same with younger people, right? I mean, just the incredible number of books that are being written for young people, by writers like Nick Stone and Jason Reynolds and Angie Thomas and Elizabeth Acevedo and on and on. This is a golden age to be teaching kids about racism.
Wonderful. That's good to hear, I think, for anyone who's got children or parents who need teaching. There are a few questions that came in about the efficacy of diversity training. And I know this is something that we all grapple with in workplaces. Peter Smith would like to know, do you have any thoughts on the best way to lead a DEI task force in a nonprofit org, or what to focus on, best type of trainings to consider for staff and board? And someone else notes, there's research that shows mandatory diversity training is not effective. How can we make anti-racist and diversity training successful even when it's not required?
So the reason why it's typically not effective is, let's say you're a corporation and you're facing a blowback because of your policies, because of your racist policies. And so instead you project out to the world that we're going to do a mass training of employees. What are you saying to the world? The problem isn't the corporation. The problem isn't the C-suite. The problem isn't the corporation's policies. The problem are the staff, right? And we're going to train them. But what if all along, again, the problem was policy? So I think a training could be effective if what the trainers are doing is training people to understand the problems in the company as they learn to understand they may be their own internal problems. But if you are just acting as if the people, everyday workers, are the problems, then obviously they're not the problem. So we're not going to actually get at a solution. And that's been one of the fascinating aspects of the DEI and even many implicit bias training sort of industry, is because they demonize workers. So it's a new way to demonize workers as opposed to, challenging the power and the policies of a particular corporation or institution.
Great, thank you. Switching gears just a little bit, and there were a few questions that were asking you to address some of the challenges that have been posed to your work. Adam Copeland asks, do you see binary conceptual frameworks such as racist versus anti-racist posing any problems to researchers deploying that framework and attempting to make sense of the world and their field? And a few people asked about specific critiques of your work, oppositional thoughts from critics like John McWhorter or Glenn Lowry, who the way it's summed up here is they believe your claims of a racial group I'm sorry, I think I'm missing some words there. Basically, they've suggested that your framework backfires on itself and makes Blacks seem helpless and opts them out from any accountability. And so I think we all want to hear these answers. And Brittany King, who is a former Black Lives Matter leader in the same town Vice President Mike Pence was born, wrote an essay recently in which she's positing the thought of Du Bois and Booker T. Washington against one another or in conjunction with one another. And she says, with that, Coleman Hughes recently made an open letter call for a conversation with you about your take on anti-racism. Will you take him up on this offer? She sees this as another example for future generations of Black intellectual debate. So these questions are all about critics of your work and how you would address that criticism, and what value can come out of those dialogues that you would have.
So first, I think the first is the discussion of binary. So last I checked, lights are either on or they're off. And that's considered an acceptable binary. In other words, in the human world, there are binaries. There are things in which there are binaries, and there are things in which they're not. Last I checked, there's really no in-between hierarchy and equality. There's no in-between injustice and justice. There's no in-between inequity or equity. And those who claim that somehow this binary is pejorative or problematic, all I'm doing is asking them to tell me what is in between inequity and equity. What is in between justice and injustice? And if they find something in between that, then I'll be more than welcome to sort of engage them on it. But I haven't been able to find any idea between a racist and an anti-racist idea. John McWhorter has claimed that my work is overly simplistic, and I actually view that as a compliment. I think one of the things that a scholar should be seeking to do is to make our work accessible so that everyday people can understand it. And if we can simplify the complexities, to me, that's a good thing, especially something as it relates to race and racism, something that affects us all. So many people don't understand racism. So then when you break it down and you make it accessible, suddenly now that's a problem. And I think it's a problem because when you simplify it from the standpoint of a racist and an anti-racist idea, and people understand it, then they begin to start looking out at the world. Then they begin to start looking out at the world of people's like John McWhorter's work. Then they start hearing him say things like, there's something wrong with Black people. Then they start rendering that idea a racist idea. So of course he's going to strike back at me as opposed to looking in the mirror at his own racist ideas. And one of the unfortunate things is many of the people, including Coleman Hughes, who have reached out and wanted to sort of engage with me, they have completely misrepresented my work. So they want me to argue with a misrepresentation. And it's hard to sort of argue with somebody who's misrepresenting what you're saying. And oftentimes a lot of the criticism is either people who are misrepresenting my work or who haven't read it. And so I'm just not going to respond to folks who are misrepresenting the work. Now, certainly if somebody represents it accurately and says something that is constructively critical, I would love to engage with those people. And indeed, you know, there's things I've learned about my work, you know, ever since it came out that have sharpened sort of me and my work. And I'm really, you know, that's the beauty of scholarship, right? We put out our work, you know, our constructive critics refine it, and it continues to hopefully get better.
Great. Well, I think,
Abby,
yes.
I want to follow up on that if I may. Do I have your permission?
Of course, my permission always.
Ibram, this is an impossible question, but I'm curious. What is the relationship between structure and agency in the long history of fighting white supremacy, of ending a racist structure? You know, do we have to tear the whole structure down first, or is it the accumulation of the change of individual will? You know, How to Be an Anti-Racist, okay. And we're all reading that. Everybody I know is reading that book, as Keisha said, and as Cornel said, you know, it's a great compliment to you that so many people are reading it. So collectively, is it a matter of changing hearts, or is it a matter of changing the system first or simultaneously? How does that dynamic of that interplay work?
So all I think I can best speak from what particularly my ancestors, particularly Black activists, have historically done. And they have historically done both. They've historically identified the ways in which the system, the structure, particularly its policymakers and policies, were endemically anti-Black and racist. And they organized sort of associations and organizations and unions to challenge that structure, to challenge that system. Now, in the process of organizing those folks together, they of course were changing minds and hearts, right? Because to be born and raised in this country is to be politically educated to think there's something wrong with Black people as opposed to racism. So in many cases, they had to transform sort of minds in the process. But I think it's a different scenario to transform minds in the context of a struggle, in the context of a movement, and to just transform minds for the sake of transforming minds. And those who have been most effective have transformed minds and then given people a direct sort of outlet for their resistance. But I'm happy you asked this because it speaks to something else that Abby had asked that I didn't respond to. That's fascinating. You know, it's fascinating that on the one hand, I am challenging this idea that Black people have no power. But then on the other hand, critics like Glenn Lowry say that I'm stripping Black people of all agency, right? So it's you know, clearly this is what I mean in terms of, you know, people who have misrepresented my work. So I've been critiqued consistently by those who claim Black people have no power. But then I'm also critiqued by those who say I'm taking away all Black people's agency. So, you know, unfortunately, you can't really win.
Abby? Oh, you're on mute, dear.
Yep, I'm all set. I'm not on mute anymore. That was fascinating. Thank you. Maybe just kind of connected to that, I think Scott Krieger asks you, there are some questions about specific, you know, other specific works, and one along the lines of work that's misrepresented. Scott Krieger asks, what do you think about the controversy and pushback against the 1619 Project? Are the people doubting the work or the value of the work coming from a racist place?
Yes.
Yes. A quick answer.
I mean, not only they're coming from a racist place, most of them, but they're also coming from an ahistorical place, and they're also coming from a vicious place. And the reason why I say vicious place, you literally, if my memory serves me correctly, you had a sitting US senator who claimed in 2020 that slavery was a necessary evil. So the brutality, the violence, the terror, the rape, the tearing up of families, that somehow that was necessary.
Yeah. There are a couple of questions about Isabel Wilkerson's recent book, Caste. One I think is James Cash, who I believe is our Harvard professor, James Cash. He says, I'd like to hear how Professor Kendi thinks about Isabel Wilkerson's framing of caste systems versus racism. And Cynthia Milliken says, if elaborating on that kind of, if racism exists through the caste system that Isabel Wilkerson describes, how do we break down and dismantle that system? Or is a caste system another racist form of racist thinking or reasoning? Can we apply anti-racist strategies to dismantle the caste system that Wilkerson describes?
So, I mean,
Ibram, excuse me, I just want you to know, James Cash is an historical figure for our people, and in the history of this university is the first Black tenured professor at the Harvard Business School, and a brilliant man and a very dear friend.
And so I think that, first of all, Isabel Wilkerson is one of the, most incredible writers, of our time. And, I would encourage everyone to read Caste. And I think in terms of the framing, whether we should use the term caste as opposed to racism, I'm agnostic. In other words, I think she understands and defines caste as a structural sort of phenomenon, as a systemic phenomenon. And so whether a person decides to use the term caste to speak to this system of racism, to this structure of racism, or the person decides to use the term racism, it's really, for me, up to the person, just so long as we understand that fundamentally this is what we're fighting. We're fighting this system, whether you want to call it a caste system or a system of racism.
Okay, thank you. There are quite a few questions from students, both high school students and college students and graduate students. So I'm going to try to go through a couple of those. Some are, shorter answers, some might be a little bit longer. Austin Benedetto says, at my high school, we have been looking into your work. We have been talking about your work mostly as it pertains to our community, the US, and in my case, New York. How does racist policy and coronavirus affect the Black community internationally? I don't know if you have done research here. I am just curious.
Well, I mean, if you look at, I think as I was talking earlier with Brother West, you can actually compare the racial wealth gap in the United States to a global racial wealth gap, in which Black people, whether it's Black people in the United States or Black folks in the Congo or South Africa or Senegal, or Black folks in Rio, or Black folks in Colombia or in Haiti, Black people are disproportionately poor in their countries, whether it's Black America, which we view as a nation within a nation since Du Bois, or other Black nations, are disproportionately under-resourced. And this is not a function of something of corruption. This is not a function of ethnic warfare. And what's ironic about the United States right now is, you know, they spent what, 20 years imagining all this massive amounts of self-defeating corruption in Africa, but nobody wants to describe what's happening right now in Washington, D.C. as even worse than anything we've seen, you know, in other countries. But that's in a sort of another sort of conversation. But yeah, this is a global problem. Race is a global construct, just like racial capitalism is global.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There are so many questions. I'm sorry. I'm just trying
You can ask one, and then I can just, because I can answer really quickly.
Yeah. No, there's one. I mean, this is a big question. It kind of goes back to some of what you were talking about a little bit earlier, kind of leading to a summing up at some point. Given all of the issues that you've outlined, and I think this may have been written, or I was thinking about it when you were addressing the need for abolition, basically, you know, and the elimination of all of these things. But someone else wrote, given all of these issues that you named, how do you determine which issue to tackle first if they're all affecting the health and well-being within Black communities and communities of color?
So I would say every individual probably is either passionate about or works in a particular sector. And so if you're a medical worker, I think you should address the abolishing health disparities, right? If you are a student, you should think about, you know, educational disparities. I think, but if you're passionate about police violence, then you should be focused on police abolition. It really is, where are you, right? And for each of us to really, you know, look in our own backyards and see our passion and our interest, because chances are, you know, we need soldiers and we need people and we need researchers, you know, in each and every one of these areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, I love that idea, because it sounds to me, the way I'm understanding that is you're really talking about the community involvement, you know, and not, although the beginning of your talk, you referenced researchers a lot. You know, I mean, that's what you were talking about is research, but it's not only for the researchers to take this on, it's for all of us to take this on. A couple of our fellows have questions, and I do want to get to those. Martha Patterson, who's a current fellow, says, how do we ensure that we don't fall into what Walter Ben Michaels calls the trouble with diversity? That is the tendency to celebrate token changes rather than dismantling systemic inequality.
So I think this is hard, because on the one hand, the effects of policies that challenge racism, you know, can be greater representation that's more reflective of humankind. But I think when we're thinking about, and this is how I sort of think about it, and I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but I think it's one thing to think about sort of representation of people, you know, let's say in an institution, in a college, let's say. And I think we should certainly be driving for more equitable representation of people, and let's say in a college. I think it's a different question when you're talking about the policymakers of a particular college or of an institution or of a community. When you're talking about policymakers, what's more important than the identity is the ideology. And so ideally, you'd have someone who has both an ideology that is shared with their identity. In other words, you know, ideally, you would have a Sherilyn Ifill deciding the case of a Breonna Taylor, as opposed to a Daniel Cameron, who is seeking to do whatever is best for his own political career at the expense of Breonna Taylor's family and her many sort of supporters, because he's looking at a Supreme Court justice seat because he's looking at potentially replacing Mitch McConnell one day. And so to me, it's not enough to just have a Black face. How much longer, how many decades do we have to see that a Black person or even a woman or even a queer person in a position of power doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be feminist, that they're going to be anti-racist, that they're going to defend queer people's rights. So really the ideology of the person. And that's how 6 months ago, really 8 months ago, you had so many young Black and Latinx people excited about an old white male for president because they were clear about policy, right? They were clear that was more important to them than, than the potential, color of one's skin or even one's gender.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot to think about. I think we'll wrap up now. One last question. First of all, I mean, the commendations in these questions is also pretty strong. So people really like what you have to say and are really provoked by, in positive, effective ways. But here's a question. Any recommendations for us for a reading list for books, podcasts, documentaries, any work that you're doing soon that you would want to share with us? I think there's a real hunger for, to get some recommendations from you and what you're reading or thinking about.
Well, obviously the fellows at the Du Bois Center, you should look up their work. First and foremost, and I think, as Skip was saying earlier, if you look around these universities in this area, it's just an incredible group of scholars who are studying racism. And chances are, whether you're talking about health or whether you're talking about criminal justice, I reference Frederick Hoffman. To me, probably the best treatment of Frederick Hoffman was, of course, Khalil Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness. They're just incredible. I would suggest, if you really want a practical sort of thing, I actually put together an anti-racist reading list for the Times and the Atlantic. And so you could always Google anti-racist reading list. And they were of sort of newer books. That's also something that you could utilize.
Great. Thank you so
Abby,
much. Yes.
I just have one final question. Again, if I may, Ibram, I wish we could go on for, and we will. We will. And I know that the thousands of people online want that as well. But I had the pleasure when we were in the waiting room to introduce you to my granddaughter, who was 5 years old. Genius, of course. I wanted her to meet you. What are her prospects? What do you think has to happen for her world to look like the world that our heroes and heroines have fought for and dreamed about, that we fight for and dream about, teach about, write about every day?
Yeah.
What practically will have to happen for this new world to be born?
So yeah, she's about the same age as my daughter. And so that's precisely what I am always thinking about. And I think that's why I ended my talk talking about the types of questions that we need to be asking, whether we as the researcher or we as the ordinary person sort of on the street. We need to be asking the biggest of questions. How do we abolish police violence? How do we abolish, and I think when we start thinking in those terms, when we start asking those types of questions, then we get big answers, right? And those big answers can then translate into big policies. And those policies can be offered up by those courageous politicians and courageous activists and courageous intellectuals who will make that case. But it starts with the question. It starts with the biggest question. And I think for too long, we have not been asking the biggest question. I mean, many scholars were, but not enough people were. And so that's what I'm urging people to do is to ask the biggest of questions, because that I think will lead to answers that then ultimately will lead to the revolution that we all want.
Ibram Kendi, thank you for gracing the long and noble tradition of the W.E.B. Du Bois Lectures at Harvard University, and for doing so eloquently, so passionately, and so thoughtfully. Thank you, brother. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.